Okay, thanks so much everyone for tuning in. Let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about Joni Mitchell, one of Canada's national treasures in my opinion, one of our greatest singer-songwriters, and indeed one of the greatest singer-songwriters of all time. So like I mentioned, she's Canadian. Um, Here's a picture of her on the right. She's best known as a vocalist, a guitarist, and a pianist, but pardon me, she does also have some talent, quite a bit of talent as a singer-songwriter, band leader, composer, instrumentalist. And aside from being a talented musician, she's also a talented visual artist and social activist. A lot of her visual art is also reflected in her music, which we'll talk about, as well as her social activism tends to pervade the lyrics in her songs. As I said, she is indeed often cited as one of the greatest songwriters of the 20th century. And that's not just in pop music or in folk music, which she's traditionally best known for, but across all musical genres. Many hugely influential artists actually cite Joni Mitchell as being quite inspirational to them. So here's a couple pictures of her in her early life. She was born Roberta Joan Anderson in 1943 in Fort Macleod, Alberta, and so she took the name Joni from her middle name. She struggled with school. She didn't traditionally excel in, or excuse me, she didn't excel in sort of the traditional subjects like math or geography or things like that. But in the arts, she did quite well. She was quickly recognized as having a talent for painting, which was originally the first art that she was drawn to. But she also studied classical piano, and early on, one of her teachers recognized as well that she had quite an affinity for poetry and a little bit of talent there. So I think her poetry skills likely influenced what would eventually become her songwriting and lyrical skills. She taught herself to play the guitar using, I believe, Pete Seeger's instruction booklet. And just by listening to records, playing by ear. She also frequently used alternative tunings. So normally a guitar is tuned E, A, D, G, B, E. But Joni Mitchell would just tune her guitar however she wanted. Part of that was due to the fact that she had a weakened left hand from polio. So the tension of playing the normal tuning, the tension on the strings, was a little bit difficult. Tony Iommi, if any of you are Black Sabbath fans, that's why he detuned his guitar for the same reason, because he had an injury to his hand and it was too much stress on his fingers to play at the traditional tuning. But then also because she was just a creative person and just learning the guitar freely. So tuning her guitar however she felt that it was comfortable, it was just an artistic way for her to express herself. She finally decided at the age of 20 that she wanted to pursue a career as a folk musician. Her parents weren't exactly thrilled about that. She had previously dropped out of high school in grade 12 and tried to attend art school, but then also dropped out of that. So moving away from Alberta to a completely new city, totally different province on her own was something that her parents weren't exactly thrilled about. But nevertheless, she did it, and of course, as we know, she became successful. The picture of her at the bottom right there is a photograph of her performing on CBC early on in her career. And you can see she's playing just a very plain, it's actually a classical guitar, where again the strings aren't as tense, they wouldn't be as stressful on your fingers. And as well, she's just wearing a very plain dress, plain hairstyle, which would be in contrast to some of the art, her artistic fashion that we would see later on in her career. So it wasn't easy for Joni Mitchell to make it as a folk singer in Toronto. She was, of course, unknown. No one yet knew the name Joni Mitchell, and she was ununioned. So she wasn't allowed to work in a lot of places that traditionally employed live music. Instead, she also had to work a retail store, I believe selling dresses to make ends meet. Not only that, but in 1965, not long after moving to Toronto, she gave birth to a daughter. So, of course, Joni Mitchell was also unmarried. Being a single mother with very little means of income, very little means of support, and barely able to even support herself, she was forced to put up her daughter for adoption, and they didn't actually even meet until about 30 years in the future, in the 1990s. She sings about it as well in one of her songs. I believe the song is off Wild Things Run Fast. Um, yeah, we'll see. She married an American, Chuck Mitchell, at the age of 21, also in 1965. So this was after the birth of her daughter. And that allowed her to move to the USA, to New York, and start perform there, and be able to work legally in the United States, which gave her more exposure, more opportunities to earn income as well. Her marriage to Chuck Mitchell didn't last. She would go on to get remarried, I think, at least twice more in her life. But she did retain that last name, Mitchell. So her early success finally came while performing in the States when she was quote unquote discovered by David Crosby, who really pushed for her to record a record and record her music professionally. You can see a picture of David Crosby and Joni Mitchell up at the top there in the black and white photograph. David Crosby's, of course, on the left with the mustache, and a very young Joni Mitchell, again, still quite young looking, is over there on the right. So she released a couple albums early on in her career. The very first one is this one at the bottom left, Songs to a Seagull. And her second one was released a year later called Clouds. And that's the one that's on the right. Both covers were painted by Mitchell herself. She did the artwork, and that would go on to become a tradition throughout her career, that she would do her album artwork herself. And in contrast to the style at the time, a lot of folk music was sort of done with overdubs and a lot of instruments. Joni Mitchell actually, though, just recorded her album solo by herself, and acoustically as well. Clouds, so her second record, actually won a Grammy performance for Best Folk Performance, and that'd be the song Clouds itself, the title track. We'll listen to one of these songs from these albums. I chose the first one, the very first track from Songs to a Seagull, and that I chose the song because it gives us an opportunity to listen to Joni Mitchell's early guitar style, as well as to get acquainted with her voice. She has a penchant for unusual melodies and unusual harmonies, and so that's something that we're going to hear at least the very early beginnings of in this first song. So those of you who are familiar with Led Zeppelin might have noticed even a very obscure reference there. Of course, there is a connection between Joni Mitchell and Led Zeppelin. She made a guest appearance. She guest sang on the Battle of Evermore, and it's either that song or Going to California. One of those two Led Zeppelin songs. There's a lyric about a king who doesn't have a queen. Pardon me, a queen who doesn't have a king. And that's, of course, a reference to this exact song that we just heard, Joni Mitchell's song, I Had a King. All right, so moving forward, Joni Mitchell continued in her same style, or rather that same early style, solo acoustic releases, to release her third record and her fourth record as well. The third one, Ladies of the Canyon, you can see up at the top left there, was released in 1970. It's a little bit of a change in style. There are a bit more instruments, a bit more overdubs, but generally she still retains most of her early style. And then the culmination of that is with Blue. So Blue is arguably her greatest album, and you can see the album cover there on the right side, in the upper half of the images. We're going to listen to the title track from that record. It was released in 1971, and it really represents a huge leap forward for Joni Mitchell in terms of songwriting. Her sense of lyricism, harmony, melody has become much more sophisticated, much more original. And indeed, David Crosby himself, if you'll recall from the previous slide, he was the one who quote-unquote discovered her. He had this to say: by the time she did Blue, she was past me and rushing toward the horizon. And so this is someone who was already himself well celebrated as a talented singer-songwriter. And indeed, you can see again another picture of him here at the bottom. That's him second from the left. And Joni Mitchell is second from the right, performing with his group, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. And so from left to right, there's Stephen Stills, David Crosby, Graham Nash, who would later go on to have a relationship with Joni Mitchell, then Joni Mitchell herself, and Neil Young on the very right. So let's take a listen to the title track, Blue. It's also an opportunity for us to hear Joni Mitchell play the piano, where of course we heard her just previously playing the guitar. That song gives me goosebumps every time I hear it, because she just throws out all the rules of traditional pop music and truly sings something so heartfelt, so raw, so emotional, and so original. She had this to say. Joni Mitchell herself, reflecting on the album Blue, said, "At that period of my life, I had no personal defenses. I felt like a cellophane wrapper on a pack of cigarettes. I felt like I had absolutely no secrets from the world, and I couldn't pretend in my life to be strong." Wow, what a powerful quote. And although many critics tend to think of Blue as being a sad album or a depressing album, rooted in tragedy or things like that, there are many artists who say just the opposite. That listening to Blue helped them connect with their own deep feelings in a way, and gave them a route out of depression, a way to rise from negative feelings, and understand that indeed there are other people. There is it is normal to feel these emotions. If you're only going to listen to one album, one Joni Mitchell album, I would really recommend listening to Blue all the way through, because absolutely every song on there is stunningly amazing in my opinion. They're not all slow and sad like Blue. There are some upbeat, happy songs, like the very first track, I think, is really, really good too. But we'll keep moving forward. I'd love to just play the whole album, but unfortunately, we don't have time. So Blue, in addition to Joni's first four records, the other three that she previously released, really catapulted her to international fame and international success. She started touring around the world, selling out concerts, making a lot of money, whereas before she had previously just been playing like fairly local, small shows. But she began touring actually with a band as well. So you can see a picture of the group there, the LA Express. They're sort of a jazz pop fusion band, and that really complemented the music that she made for her next album, Chord and Spark. Chord and Spark represents sort of a shift away from folk music, more of a direction towards pop. But we'll get there. I don't want to give too much away. But no one would really predict where Joni Mitchell was going to go next after Chord and Spark. Chord and Spark was really well received. Probably next to Blue, it's widely considered to be her second best album, although there are some people who say that Chord and Spark is actually her best overall. It received 4 Grammy nominations, and it did actually win one, Best Arrangement for Instrumental and Vocals, and that was again for the title track, Chord and Spark. We're going to listen to one of her most popular radio songs, one of the most popular singles that was released from this album, and that also shows a side of her political activism and her sense of care for the environment. So the song from Chord and Spark that we're going to listen to is this track called Big Yellow Taxi. So a pretty stark commentary on the state of the environment. A lot of lyrics that make really direct references. Hey, farmer, farmer, put away that DDT now. They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. Still messages that are relevant today. So the second half of the 1970s saw Joni Mitchell branching out even more to new, unexplored sonic territory. The first album that she released, sort of this quadrilogy of experimentation, was 1975's The Hissing of Summer Lawns. And you can see the album cover for that record at the top left there. This album was sort of experimental and forward-thinking in that it used samples of African musicians. It was a way to incorporate world music, which wasn't something that was traditionally being done in pop music until about 5 years later, in the 1980s, and really didn't start to get rolling and become mainstream until about 10 years later. Her next album, Hey Jura, Saw her experimenting more with jazz and moving more into a jazz direction, fusing jazz and pop, but really again with the focus on jazz. She collaborated with the extremely talented bassist Jaco Pastorius. If any of you are unfamiliar with him, I highly recommend looking him up. His life is an incredible story, and he's just an amazing musician. And Hey Jira is a really, really cool album. There's not really one sort of standout song from it, in my opinion. It's sort of an album that needs to be listened to all the way through from start to finish, but really, really cool ideas. Her next album, 1977's Don Juan's Reckless Daughter, was a double album. So it was released with 2 LPs, 4 sides. And you can see the picture, the album cover sort of cut off at the bottom left there. Side 2, I believe it was, features a 16-minute piano improvisation that was orchestrated at the same time. So this piece was meant to be its own type of original expression, and the improvisation wasn't just a way to sort of fill up time. Joni Mitchell herself commented that making music in the moment and improvising in the moment is a very different sort of expression and very different compositional style than what you create when you sit down and compose something over a period of weeks or months or maybe even years. So again, the piece is a little bit derided, but it's a way, I think, for Mitchell to release a new form of expression, acquaint her audience with another side of her music. Finishing off this sort of quadrilogy of experimentational albums of the 1970s, she released the album Mingus in 1979, which was a collaboration between her and another jazz bassist, Charles Mingus. And you can see a picture, actually, of them, Joni Mitchell in the bottom right. Joni Mitchell is, of course, on top, and Charles Mingus is at the bottom. The tracks on the album are interspersed with short dialogue, recorded dialogue from Mingus. I believe they're all Mingus, and I think he's talking about just a number of different subjects. One of them, for example, is his birthday. We're going to listen to the very last track from this album, the 1979 Mingus release. The track is called Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. And for those of you who are already Charles Mingus fans, you'll already be familiar with this song. But Joni Mitchell wrote original lyrics for it, so we'll hear her sing. As well, I believe it's Jaco Pastorius playing the bass. The song is a little bit longer than some of the other previous ones we've heard. It's about 5.5 minutes, 6 minutes or so, if I recall. It starts off a little bit slow. It's going to sound very different from some of the tracks that we've already heard. But stick with it. It's worth listening to all the way through. Alright, so yeah, very different from some of the songs that we heard before. But still some elements that are a little bit the same. Joni Mitchell's soaring vocals, I think, are one of the most impressive things about that track. And it is a tragedy that Mingus never got to see it released. He died, I think, just maybe 2 months before the album came out. So moving into the 1980s, audiences were beginning to feel disconnected with Joni Mitchell's music. They weren't always on board with all the experimentation that she was doing on her albums. Some people just enjoyed listening to her classic folk material more. And then as well, when she performed this material live, they weren't really that enthusiastic about seeing it performed that way either. So gradually her audiences started to dwindle, and in the 1980s, she made somewhat of a return to pop. So she signed to Geffen Records for a trio of electric albums, which were somewhat of a moderate success. The first one at the top, Wild Things Run Fast, I would say is probably the most successful of the three. For me, it's certainly the most listenable of the three. The next ones, Dog Eat Dog and Chalk Marks in the Rain, they represent, again, a bit more of a return to experimentation, especially the third one, Chalk Marks in the Rain. She uses a lot of synthesizers, which is quite different from her previous records. But I think that one of the biggest contrasts, too, is the fact that now she's more often playing an electric guitar than acoustic instruments, either piano or acoustic guitar. We'll listen to the first track from Wild Things Run Fast. This is the song that I was saying I think Joni Mitchell makes a reference to the daughter that she gave up for adoption. It might be one of the tracks on Blue. We'll see. Let's take a listen to Wild Things Run Fast. So no, it's not that song. Yeah, sorry. To be honest, I forget exactly which song it was. Maybe it's a Little Green off of Blue. Um, yeah, not sure. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that we can see from the picture on the right that by the time the 1980s and the late 1980s, 1990s started to roll around, Joni Mitchell was no longer a young woman. She's no longer a young adult. We can see here that she's middle-aged. I mean, she herself personally has evolved and grown, just like her music did, sonically evolved and grew. So in the 1990s, with many of her fans clamoring for new material that reflected what she was originally writing in the late 60s, early 70s, when she started to become famous. Solo acoustic music. Joni Mitchell did indeed release two more records, Turbulent Indigo and Taming the Tiger, which the second one, the latter one, was actually supposed to be her last release of original material. But she actually did wind up releasing one more record. And these albums did fairly well. They were critically well received. They were somewhat commercially successful. Of course, nowhere near as commercially successful as her original early material. I mean, Blue still continues to dominate her discography. But in general, yeah, these are good records. I think the other pretty cool thing is that around this time she began to play a custom-built guitar. So a guitar that had been custom made for her to automatically transpose her unique tunings. So she didn't need to bring many guitars around with her on tour, have multiple guitar techs backstage retuning all her guitars for her song by song. Because at this point in the Joni Mitchell songbook, she was well up to over 50 different tunings that she would have to memorize for all her different songs. And I mean, she herself even said that there were some songs she could no longer remember how to play. She had other people who were keeping track of her compositions, remembering, writing them down, and making sure that there was an avenue to remember them that way. The other consequence of Joni Mitchell aging was that her vocal range began to decrease. She was a lifelong smoker. She started smoking, I believe, at the age of 11. If it wasn't 11, it was very, very young. And although she herself didn't say or decline to acknowledge that cigarettes may have influenced or may have some sort of role in her decreasing vocal range, I think myself personally, I think it's probably a likely cause. Of course, it is just natural that as people age, their vocal range does decrease. But she also had a number of other problems that could also be associated with cigarettes, like polyps that had to be removed, I think, from her vocal cords. So, I mean, earlier in Joni Mitchell's life, I did mention that she was a bit of a sickly child. She did have polio, but now we're starting to see, too, some of the first signs of health issues in her later life that are now beginning to impact her career and her performance. We're not going to listen to any of the songs from either of these albums, Turbulent Indigo or Taming the Tiger. Rather, instead, I'd like to listen to one of the very last songs that she's released so far. So we'll get there. In her later career, she released a pair of albums afterwards, which she said was basically just to fill contractual obligations. And she began to complain quite a bit about the state of the music industry. She went back to focus on the visual arts, and you can see the picture of here on the right of her in her house, surrounded by original paintings and various art like that. She did release one more record fairly independently. It was released through the Starbucks label. Again, it was a minimal album about political and environmental issues. She said herself it was something that she felt very strongly about recording, sort of a message that she felt the world needed to hear. And so, not wanting to be encumbered by the music industry, that's why she opted to go through Starbucks. We're going to listen to the title track from that record, Shine. The track is itself, of course, called Shine. And it will be the longest song that we've heard so far. I think it's about 7 minutes long. It's a bit more of an experimental track. We'll hear some synthesizers, which we haven't really heard before from Joni Mitchell's discography. But the lyrics and the vocals, I think, are classic Joni. So, nice song, very clear message in the lyrics, a little bit paradoxical, but yeah, definitely poetic. So Joni Mitchell's legacy, uh, she continues to be held in high esteem by her peers. Her music is remembered for having powerful lyrics, inspirational melodies, unconventional harmonies, and pioneering innovations. I think all of those qualities fairly characterize Joni Mitchell's music. Sadly, in 2015, she suffered a brain aneurysm, and she's only made a few public appearances since then. Nothing music related. It was so serious that apparently some spokesperson for her said that even 2 years later, I believe, she is still in physical rehabilitation, relearning how to walk. So I think it's unlikely that we'll ever see her perform live again. It's I think it's possibly also fairly unlikely, or excuse me, probably fairly unlikely we'll ever see any more original music from her, a new album or even a new song, unless there's something just sort of buried in the vaults that can maybe be reworked. But in many ways, she's spent many years putting out powerful messages, and I think yeah, as I started to say, in many ways, she's accomplished her goals as an artist. We can see here as well. There's a picture of her star on the Canadian Walk of Fame, and there's the picture at the top right is her greatest hits album, one of the most recent ones, Joni 75. You can see a picture of her there on the cover in her senior years. The pictures at the bottom are just pictures of her with other various famous musicians. Neil Young is in sort of the middle there, and then Herbie Hancock, the famous jazz pianist, is who she's shaking hands with at the bottom right. And Herbie Hancock himself even released an album in tribute to Joni Mitchell. I think it's called the Joni Mitchell Letters. They're all piano covers of Joni Mitchell's music. It's such a great album, really, really well worth listening to. So that's going to be the very end of my presentation there. If you were a fan of Joni Mitchell, if you liked what you heard, of course I'd recommend going to go back and listen to the albums in full, listening to all her albums in full. They're really all worth listening to, especially all those ones through the 70s. I'd say from Songs to a Seagull all the way to Mingus. No, even Wild Things Run Fast is probably the discography that I go through the most. But other artists, other similar artists, Buffy St. Marie is another female Canadian singer-songwriter, folk musician. She's Indigenous, so she has a bit of a different perspective on things. And The Weather Station is a cool female singer-songwriter as well from Canada, from around Toronto. And she's fairly new, a bit of a younger generation, so also with a bit of a different perspective from how Joni Mitchell sees the world. If you're interested in my slides, they're available, this one and many others, at my store, Teachers Pay Teachers, which is just under my name, Robert McKnight. If you're interested in hiring me for any proofreading or editing services, I do have a master's degree, which I've cited at the bottom, but you can also find another store of mine for services at fiverr.com. I also run a blog. I write, right now I'm doing a project called Classical Music Doesn't Suck, and you can read that at my WordPress site, drrobertsite.wordpress.com. I've got a few articles on there about really cool classical music and a bit of the history behind some of the songs, which I update every Friday. As well, on my Twitch page, there are links to my YouTube channel, where I post all my lecture slides afterwards, minus the musical examples. and then a link to my Twitter, where I post links throughout the week to cool songs that I happen to be listening to at the moment. So thanks everyone for tuning in. That's it. That's everything. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see all of you next week. If any of you have any requests, anything in particular that you want to hear, of course, shoot me a message. I'd be happy to incorporate that.